The first time Jake saw the property, he knew it was meant to be his. Tucked away at the edge of a quiet suburban neighborhood, it was everything he had dreamed of, just enough land for a small vegetable garden, a few chickens, and, of course, his two mischievous goats, Buddy and Lulu. After years of grinding away at a corporate job, trapped in fluorescent-lit offices and endless meetings, he had finally saved enough to leave it all behind. The idea of waking up to fresh air, tending to his own food, and living without the constant hum of city noise felt like freedom. For the first few months, it was exactly that. His neighbors were friendly, stopping by to offer gardening tips in exchange for some fresh eggs or juicy tomatoes. Kids from the neighborhood would peek over the fence, giggling at Buddy and Lulu, who had quickly earned a reputation for their playful antics, chewing on shoelaces, nudging visitors for attention, and once, even escaping into a neighbor's yard just to steal a bite of their flower bed. The community seemed warm, welcoming, a perfect balance between suburban charm and country peace. And then Karen showed up. It was a Saturday afternoon, and Jake had been enjoying the simple pleasure of watching his goats bask in the sun when he heard the unmistakable click-click-click of approaching heels on pavement. He turned to see a sharp-faced woman with a rigid bob haircut and an iron grip on a clipboard marching up his driveway. Everything about her posture screamed self-importance, and before he could even greet her, she shoved a thick stack of papers into his hands. "I assume you've read the HOA guidelines," she asked, the tightest, most insincere smile plastered across her face. Jake frowned, flipping through the pages. He had barely moved in when he learned that the neighborhood had a homeowners association, but he had made sure to buy just outside of its jurisdiction. It was a deliberate choice, no rules, no unnecessary restrictions, just his own slice of peace and quiet. "I'm not part of the HOA," he said, giving her a polite but firm smile. Karen's expression didn't even flinch. Instead, she dramatically gestured toward the goats, as if they were some sort of crime against humanity. "We have standards in this neighborhood," she said, her voice dripping with manufactured politeness. "Your setup isn't exactly in line with our community aesthetic." Jake let out a small chuckle, thinking this had to be some kind of joke. "Who complains about goats?" "Well, I appreciate your concern," he said, "but I checked all the zoning laws before I moved in. This farm's been here longer than the HOA has even existed." For the first time, Karen's plastic smile flickered, but it was only for a second. Then, just as quickly, she straightened, smoothing out her already stiff posture. "Oh, I see," she said sweetly. Too sweetly. "Well, we'll just have to look into that, won't we?" With that, she turned on her heel and walked away. Jake stood there for a moment, watching as she disappeared down the street, clipboard tucked under her arm like a weapon. A chill ran up his spine, though he couldn't quite place why. He should have known. Karen wasn't done with him. Not by a long shot. Jake didn't have to wait long to find out just how serious Karen was about looking into things. Within a week, small signs of trouble started cropping up, side eyes from certain neighbors, hushed conversations that stopped when he walked by, and an unusual increase in people staring at his property as they passed. Something was brewing, and it didn't take a genius to figure out who was behind it. Then came the HOA meeting flyer, slipped into his mailbox even though he wasn't part of the association. "Emergency discussion, community standards and property value concerns," the bold print read. It didn't name him directly, but he didn't have to guess. He decided to show up, just to hear what she had to say. The meeting was held in Karen's pristine backyard, where neatly trimmed hedges and a perfectly symmetrical flower garden made it look more like a display home than a real place people lived. Jake leaned against a fence post, arms crossed, watching as Karen dramatically cleared her throat and launched into a speech about the dangers of unsanctioned agricultural operations. She framed it as if she were protecting the neighborhood from some kind of rural apocalypse, using phrases like pest infestations, health hazards, and declining property values. What she didn't expect was pushback. "I don't know," Karen, an older man, Mr. Talbot, spoke up. Jake's been here for months, and all I've seen is free tomatoes and happy kids feeding goats. Seems like a nice addition to the neighborhood if you ask me. A few others nodded in agreement. Karen's jaw tightened, her fingers pressing into the clipboard as though she wanted to snap it in half. She forced a thin-lipped smile. Of course, some people may enjoy it, but we must think long-term, she said, glancing around as if waiting for a bigger wave of support. It never came. That might have stopped anyone else. Not Karen. Days later, Jake woke up to find a city health inspector standing in his driveway. A report had been filed, citing unsanitary conditions and a possible health risk due to livestock waste. The inspector, a no-nonsense woman in her 40s, walked through the garden, checked the water supply, and even inspected the chicken coop. Jake followed her, arms crossed, already suspecting who was behind it. When she finished, she shook her head and pulled out her notepad. I have to say, this is one of the cleanest setups I've seen. Whoever called this in must have been misinformed. Jake chuckled. Or they have too much time on their hands. He glanced at Karen's house, where a curtain fluttered suspiciously. She had been watching. Of course, she had. The health inspector left, but Karen wasn't done. A few mornings later, Jake was sipping his coffee when two police cruisers pulled up to his driveway. Officers stepped out, looking around as if expecting chaos. One approached, his tone professional but firm. We got a report of loose animals causing disturbances. Goats running wild, knocking over trash cans, chasing children. Jake nearly spit out his coffee. He motioned to Buddy and Lulu, who were, predictably, napping in the shade, their fat bellies rising and falling as they slept. One of the officers sighed, rubbing his temple. Yeah. Thought so. We've had some exaggerated complaints before, but we have to check every call. Let me guess, Jake said, folding his arms. The call came from a woman with a bob haircut and an overwhelming sense of self-importance? The officer chuckled, shaking his head. Didn't say, but let's just say, this isn't our first time dealing with that house. Jake thanked them, and as they left, he noticed Karen's blinds snap shut. The next incident was worse. One morning, Jake stepped outside and froze. Dead rats lay scattered near his vegetable garden, their bodies unnaturally stiff. His stomach turned. This wasn't nature, this was sabotage. Before he could react, a van with a Department of Public Health logo rolled up. The official who stepped out informed him that an anonymous report had been filed about a rodent infestation linked to his farm. Jake's blood ran cold. Karen had planted them there. The inspector, thankfully, was thorough. After a full check of his property, he found nothing unsanitary. Looks like someone's trying to frame you, the man muttered as he filled out his report. Jake clenched his jaw, his fists tightening at his sides. Karen had crossed the line. This wasn't just petty neighborhood politics anymore, this was deliberate sabotage. That night, as Jake locked up the barn and checked on Buddy and Lulu, he made a decision. He had spent weeks playing defense, but Karen wasn't going to stop until she either got what she wanted or someone made her back down. It was time to fight back. Jake had always believed in minding his own business, but Karen had pushed him to a breaking point. He had tried to be civil, to brush off her antics, to ignore the petty complaints and the underhanded tactics. But planting dead rats on his property? Calling the police with fabricated reports? Sabotaging his reputation? That was war. And if Karen wanted one, she was going to get it. He started by doing something Karen would never expect, he dug into the HOA's bylaws. She had spent so much time weaponizing the rules against him that she probably assumed no one else would bother reading them. But Jake was thorough. He spent late nights combing through the dense legal language, searching for any clause, any loophole, anything that could be turned against her. And then he found it. A provision that allowed homeowners to formally remove an HOA board member if they could prove abuse of power. It wasn't easy, it required a formal complaint, a detailed record of misconduct, and most importantly, a petition signed by at least a third of the neighborhood. Jake smirked. That was doable. But first, he needed to ensure Karen didn't have the upper hand. She had already shown that she wasn't above rigging the game, and he had no doubt she would try something drastic if she felt cornered. He installed security cameras around his property, covering every possible entrance. If Karen so much as breathed in the direction of his fence, he'd have proof. Then, he started talking to his neighbors. Most of them didn't need much convincing. The ones who had always liked him were quick to sign. Others, even the ones who had stayed neutral before, were starting to see Karen for what she really was. The planted rats, the fake police calls, the endless stream of complaints, it had become obvious that this wasn't about neighborhood standards anymore. It was about power. Karen must have sensed something was shifting, because she doubled down on her attacks. One morning, Jake walked outside to find his goat enclosure wide open. Buddy and Lulu were gone. His heart slammed against his ribs as he scanned the yard. Then, in the distance, he saw them, wandering up the street, nibbling on someone's flower bed. And right there, standing at the end of her driveway, was Karen, phone in hand, snapping photos. The police arrived within minutes. Another complaint. This time, Karen claimed that Jake's goats had been running loose, trampling lawns, and posing a danger to small children. But this time, Jake had proof. He pulled out his phone and played back the security footage from the night before. The video showed Karen sneaking into his yard, fiddling with the gate, and deliberately unlatching it before scurrying away like a criminal in the night. The officer sighed, rubbing his forehead. Well, that changes things. He turned to Karen, who had suddenly gone pale. This is out of context, she stammered. I was just. Ma'am, we're going to need you to come down to the station for questioning. The sight of Karen being escorted to the back of a police cruiser should have felt like victory, but Jake knew better. She wasn't finished. And sure enough, she came back worse than ever. When she returned home later that night, she wasn't humbled. She was furious. The very next morning, the city posted a formal notice on Jake's fence. A new ordinance had been passed, one that banned farm animals within residential zones. Jake stared at the paper, his blood boiling. Karen had lobbied to get a law passed, just to get rid of his goats. She wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. But what she didn't realize was that she had just given him exactly what he needed. Jake took the notice straight to his neighbors, the same people she had been trying to manipulate for months. You see this? He asked, holding up the paper. Karen pulled strings at City Hall to pass an entire law, just because she doesn't like that I have goats. She doesn't care about this neighborhood. She doesn't care about any of us. She just wants control. That was it. The last straw. The signatures came pouring in. By the end of the week, Jake had more than enough support to file the formal complaint against Karen. And with the cameras, the fake police reports, the paper trail of harassment, and now, a city ordinance she personally orchestrated just to target him, he had all the evidence he needed. Karen thought she was untouchable. But she was about to find out just how wrong she was. Karen was not the type to go down quietly. The moment Jake filed his formal complaint with the HOA board, she went into full damage control mode. Instead of acknowledging the growing list of grievances against her, she did what she always did, tried to manipulate the system in her favor, Her first move was rigging the upcoming HOA election. The board had scheduled a vote to review Jake's complaint, and if enough members found her guilty of abuse of power, she would lose her position as HOA president. Karen couldn't let that happen. So, in the most Karen move possible, she changed the meeting date at the last minute, only notifying homeowners she knew were loyal to her. When Jake and his supporters showed up at the original scheduled time, they found an empty room, no meeting. No vote. Nothing. Jake knew exactly what she had done, and he also knew she had overplayed her hand. That night, he gathered a few of his closest allies in the neighborhood, including some longtime residents who had once tolerated Karen but were now fed up. They had one simple plan: catch her in the act and expose her publicly. The following evening, Karen hosted what she claimed was a private gathering for select HOA members. What it really was? A secret strategy meeting to discredit Jake. Jake, however, had planted one of his neighbors, Mrs. Henderson, a sweet but sharp-witted woman in her 70s, right in the middle of it. She had played the role of a concerned citizen perfectly, nodding along as Karen ranted about how Jake was a menace, a lawbreaker, a threat to their peaceful suburban paradise. What Karen didn't know: Mrs. Henderson was recording the entire thing. And the next day, at an impromptu neighborhood barbecue, attended by nearly everyone except Karen, Jake played the audio for the entire community to hear. Karen's voice came through loud and clear. Asterisk, if we can't get rid of him legally, we need to make him miserable until he leaves on his own. Asterisk. Asterisk, I don't care if the city says his farm is up to code. We keep calling, keep filing complaints, keep the pressure on. Everyone has a breaking point. Asterisk. Asterisk, and if that doesn't work, we'll make sure the next HOA election stays in our favor. I'm not losing control over this neighborhood. Asterisk. The backyard fell into stunned silence. Karen, who had apparently overheard the commotion and decided to crash the gathering, stood frozen as all eyes turned to her. Jake folded his arms. Want to tell everyone why you've been trying to run me out of my own home? Karen's face turned ghostly white, then, just as quickly, she tried to play it off. This is out of context, she snapped. You don't understand. Oh, I think we understand perfectly, Mr. Talbot cut in, shaking his head. You've been harassing a man for months because you don't like his goats. It's not about the goats. Karen blurted out before realizing how absurd she sounded. Jake smirked. So what is it about then, Karen? She had no answer. The crowd murmured, some whispering to each other, others openly shaking their heads. The spell Karen had held over them for years was finally broken. And then came the final blow. Two HOA board members, looking uncomfortably guilty, stepped forward. Karen, one of them said carefully, we looked into some financial discrepancies after Jake's complaint. And, well, we found something. Jake raised an eyebrow. This was news to him. The other board member cleared his throat. We discovered, funds that were supposed to be allocated for community projects were instead used for personal expenses. Karen's head snapped toward them. That's ridiculous. What are you accusing me of? But then, they handed Jake a manila folder. Inside were copies of transactions that didn't add up. Thousands of dollars in security upgrades, but only at Karen's house. A repaved driveway, paid for with HOA money. Mysterious appreciation dinners at high-end restaurants, with only Karen and her closest friends in attendance. Jake let out a low whistle. Wow, Karen. You weren't just coming after me. You were stealing from your own neighbors. That was it. The final straw. Before Karen could stammer out another excuse, one of the board members announced that they were officially voting on her removal, right then and there. The result? Unanimous. Karen was no longer the president of the HOA. Her face burned red, her lips quivering with rage. She looked around, desperate for support, but all she got were disapproving stares. She had lost. But even as she stormed off, everyone knew she wouldn't go down without one last desperate move. Karen always had one more trick up her sleeve. Karen was finished, but her downfall wasn't just about losing her title, it was about facing real consequences for her actions. The very next week, the HOA board released a formal statement apologizing to the community for Karen's behavior. More importantly, they announced a full audit of HOA funds, and when the final report came back, it was even worse than anyone expected. Karen hadn't just misused HOA money for a few personal upgrades, she had been embezzling funds for years. Thousands of dollars meant for neighborhood maintenance had been funneled into her own bank account, disguised under fake invoices and emergency expenses. She hadn't just abused her power against Jake, she had stolen from the very people she claimed to protect. The HOA forwarded the evidence to the authorities, and within a month, Karen found herself under official investigation for fraud. Rumors swirled that she had lawyers scrambling to keep her out of court, but her reputation was destroyed. The same neighbors who once feared her now spoke about her in hushed, satisfied tones, shaking their heads at how far she had fallen. Then, one day, she was gone. A for sale sign appeared in front of her house practically overnight. No one saw her move, no one said goodbye. Some joked that she had fled to a tiny apartment in another town, while others said she was hiding in shame. Either way, Karen's reign was over. And Jake? He thrived. With Karen gone, the neighborhood embraced his farm completely. The HOA, now under new leadership, actually invited him to help rewrite neighborhood policies to prevent future abuse. Families brought their kids over to feed Buddy and Lulu, and the once controversial farm became a beloved part of the community. One afternoon, Jake received a letter from the city council, a formal commendation for exposing corruption and improving the neighborhood. Attached was an invitation to an award ceremony. Jake laughed as he read it. He had never set out to be a hero. He just wanted to grow his tomatoes and take care of his goats. But sometimes, standing up for yourself turns into something much bigger. As he sat on his porch, watching the sunset, Buddy let out a loud bleat, nudging his arm. Jake chuckled, scratching the goat behind the ears. "You were right all along, Buddy," he murmured. "Karma always wins." Have you ever had to deal with a Karen in your neighborhood? Share your experience below, let's see who had it worse.